Well, hello and welcome to today's lab. Today we're going to be talking about date parameters and functions. One thing that's very important in a report that we create in real life, for instance, when you log into your bank account, you don't pull all the information in your bank account for the last 3 or 10 years. What you look at is usually the last week or the last day, and then you can change the date range. Another example of how date parameters are used and how important it is if you try and book a flight, for example, or book a hotel. By default, you cannot book yesterday's date. You would have to book later today onwards. So there's a lot of checks on, there's an importance to date parameters as well as a lot of checking into the date parameters to make sure that we're putting within a normal range. In some cases, you can't book more than 6 months or 1 year ahead because of all changes that could happen. So a date parameter is needed so that you get the data much faster in a way that makes sense, and then it allows you to have a date range so that you could choose a different range. So if I'm flying out, I want to be able to choose the day that I'm flying out by default the next week or the next 30 days, but then I could extend that time window. If I'm logging into my bank account, I usually want to see the last 30 days or the last month, but then I could extend that and look at what happened 6 months ago, for instance. So that's what we're covering today, date parameters and functions. Our first assignment on date parameters and functions is, and that's on line 4, to create a report that allows the customer to view all flights flying within the next 2 days by default. So when they come to run the report by default, they should have tomorrow's date and after tomorrow's date. Customers can change the date range. So they can go in and say, well, instead of flying out tomorrow, I want to fly out in a week or 10 days. But by default, that report should have a date that either that includes tomorrow and the day after, regardless of whether I'm flying out today or 6 months from today, whatever today's date is, and that's why we need that parameter. So we're going and create this exercise. So first, let's look at the database that we have, because there are certain things that we're going to need to create our report. The first one is going to be our database server, and our database server is Learn IT Courses, as you can see it over here. The second one is going to be the database name. So we have our database name as Learn IT Courses Online database. Next is our data set or query that we're going to get the data through. And so our data set becomes that select statement, the columns that we need from the table that we need. However, as we do know, we're looking for a certain date range that starts with tomorrow's date, regardless of what today's date is, and ending with the date after that, so that we have that 2 dates range. So what we're going to have is a condition that shows that our flight date is between a start date and an end date, one which is tomorrow and one is just the way. So basically today plus 1 date, and then the other one is today plus 2 days. And as such, we add the condition for our parameters, which is our flight date is going to be greater than or equal to a start date, which we're going to set later in our report as whatever the date is today plus 1 day, and then the flight date, which is going to be less than or equal to whatever today's date is plus 2 days. So now let's go ahead and start creating our report. So we'll kick off our report builder. The table of metrics wizard, create a data set. Next, we're going to create a new data source. And we're going to name our data source ticketing. Now we need to build a connection. So the first thing we need is our server name. So we'll take that server name and add it right here. Since we're connecting to the server, we don't need to copy and paste the database name or fill that in. It's going to be in our dropdown. It's the Learn IT Courses Online database. We're going to click OK. So now we've created our data source with our data server and our database name. Click OK. Next, now we'd like to create our data set where we're getting our data from. So we're just going to copy that select statement, even though it's a flight date, but we have 2 parameters, so we should have 2 parameters once that report is created. Next. So with our flight date greater than or equal to start date, that's going to be the first date that's going to show up, and then that's going to be the end date of that range. We're going to click next. For now, we're just going to move everything to values. So we'll highlight everything, drag and drop, next, next, finish. We should have our report. So we have a start date and an end date. If we go back to our database and look at the data sets that we have data for August 12th through August 14th. So we should be able to enter data for our start date and end dates. Before I even enter it, a normal customer or a normal user on our website would not know what date format it is. Am I entering year, then month, then date? Am I entering month, date, then year? Does it matter what format it is? Do I type it as DECE, short for December, or the whole word December, or just 12 for the month? What order do I enter it in? It's very confusing. However, we're going to go ahead and enter it in the right format. So if we enter the format month/date/year, we're going to get our data. And since the flight's on the 14th or past midnight, beginning of the day, I don't think the 14th is going to show. But this is the format that allows us to get the data back. However, if you were to get into your bank account or make any reservations online, you do have a calendar. You don't have to enter the date in this good old-fashioned. So how do we do that? We'll go back to Design, Parameters, and the start date, let's change that parameter, is not a text. It's a date time, so let's change that to date time. Similarly, end date is also not a text, so let's change that to a date time and click OK. Now let's run the report. Voila, we have our date ranges. So all I have to do now is click on a calendar. Today's the 11th, so I can choose the 12th, and I can choose through the 15th. Calendar format, let it worry about formatting the date for me, and I've got my data. We're getting a step closer. Now what we would like to do by default is, instead of having the customer select the start date and the end date, we want to be able to do that for them. We want to have the default value of, if today's the 11th, then by default add one more date, and in the case of the end date, add two more dates there by default. So they don't even have to select it, because that's what most cases are. We know what our defaults are, or the requirements for this project are. Just like in your bank account, by default, we're looking for for whatever date it is since the beginning of that month or the last 30 days. That's our default values. Our requirement here is for the future 2 dates. So we want to make that a default value. So how do we do that? We click on Design. Let's go to our start date parameter. So there's a real nice function that we're going to use that allows us to set a default date. So we're going to go to Default Values. And in there, we have the option of a no default value, which is what we have right now. We can specify a value or get a value from a query. In this case, we want to specify values, so we're going to click Add, and there's a function. So basically, the function allows us to, the value is going to be equal to date add, and then whatever the date is, D between brackets, comma, add one day to it. So that's why we have a +1 to whatever today is, and then that function, and we close the brackets. So the start date is going to be whatever today's date is, which is August the 11th. Add one more date, it's going to be the 12th, and let's close that out. And then the end date, we're going to do the same thing. Parameters. We're going to put a default value, specify the value, add. So date add to the date, whatever the date value is, we want to add, in this case, let's make it 3 to whatever today's date is, function, and then close that bracket. So now if we run it, we don't have to enter a value. We should already have a value, which is the 12th through the 14th. So since today's the 11th, it knew to add for the start date +1, so it became the 12th. And since today is the 11th, it added 3 days, so it's the 14th. So here's an example of how we could set our parameters and default values, covering the requirements that we had for this assignment, which is to create a report that allows the customer to view all flights flying within the next 2 days. In this case, we've made 3 days by default. And then customers can change the date range, which means, yes, this is the default, but they can go in and change it. So if they need to switch it back to the 13th, they can always go back and limit the view that they have. So they can change the parameters, but when they log it makes sense to have a default value. Now, one of the biggest things in reports is what we call the date function or date precision. In other words, when I run this select statement, I'm getting the airline, flight number, flight date, flight from, flight to, and price. Well, let's go ahead and just zero in on one specific column, which is our flight date. Let's run this. And I'm getting the date, time of the flights that I have. Different reports, as we work in different projects in different companies, are going to need different date formats. If you're working in a company in England or India, for example, you want to show the day, then the month, then the year. In the United States, for instance, you want to show the month, then the date, then the year. Now, the format of the month itself could be different. You might want the first 3 characters. So if it's August, you want AUG versus 8. You might want 8-12 versus 8/12 for the month and date separation. So there's different functions. The way that I show the date needs a different format. So this is the next query that we're going to build. We're going to select the flight date. However, we want to show it in different ways that more than likely as you work with your reports, you're going to need to format the date accordingly. Now, if we notice closely, we're selecting the flight date. And all throughout, we're selecting flight date, flight date, flight date from this table. So all we should get is the flight date so many times. However, each time we're converting it to a certain format. And so the way that we display the data is going to look differently, even though it's the same column. So let's go ahead and execute this. And that way, whenever we need to choose a date on a different format, we know that there are functions that allow us to convert it to display it in that format. So we'll go ahead and execute this. And notice we are looking at the same date, which is, or the same flight time, which is August 12th, 2018, 6:15 a.m. If I need a different format where I'm showing the month, the first 3 characters, then I'll choose this format, which allows me to have it as AUG 12/2018. This one is slightly different. This one shows me the hour, the minutes. This one shows the hour, the minutes, and goes into more precision. This one displays the date before the month versus this one displays the month before the date, and so on and so forth. So we do have different ways of displaying the data. We get to pick the format that we like. And with this, we conclude our exercise for today. And with that, we can create a report, in this case, allowing us to make the customers view the flights within a date range, which is, in this case, both parameters. Good luck with your development.